A cold wind swept through the narrow streets of old Montreal the night Isabella Clarke disappeared. It was the kind of night locals barely noticed anymore. Late autumn, the sky hanging low with clouds, the stone sidewalks slick from a recent rain. The old street lamps cast long yellow shadows against the historic buildings, and the St. Lawrence River moved silently in the darkness beyond the harbor. At exactly 9:42 p.m., Isabella Clarke sent her last message. "I think someone is following me." The message was sent to a man named Mateo Alvarez. 10 minutes later, Isabella vanished. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened on that quiet Montreal street. But investigators believe the truth may lie somewhere between two people who met by chance, and a secret neither of them fully understood. Isabella Clarke had moved to Canada only 8 months earlier. She was 28 years old, originally from Manchester, England, and had always dreamed of living abroad. Friends described her as curious, adventurous, and endlessly optimistic. She had taken a job as a freelance translator, working remotely for international clients while exploring the world whenever she could. Montreal had quickly become her favorite place. The blend of European architecture and North American energy made her feel strangely at home. She loved the narrow cobblestone streets, the cafes that stayed open past midnight, and the quiet walks along the river. But more than anything else, Montreal gave Isabella something she had been searching for after a difficult year back in England. A fresh start. Her friends back home knew very little about what had driven her to leave so suddenly. They only knew that she rarely spoke about her past anymore. Instead, she talked about the future. About new opportunities. About the people she was meeting. One of those people was Mateo Alvarez. Mateo had arrived in Montreal only a few weeks before Isabella met him. He was 32 years old, originally from Medellin, Colombia, and worked as a freelance photographer specializing in urban landscapes and documentary projects. His photographs captured Montreal in ways that few locals ever noticed. Hidden alleyways, reflections of neon lights on wet pavement, lonely figures walking through the fog along the waterfront. His work had started gaining attention online, and several local galleries had begun expressing interest in his photography. Mateo first met Isabella inside a small cafe near Place Jacques Cartier. It was a rainy afternoon, and the cafe was nearly empty. Isabella was sitting by the window with her laptop open, translating documents for a client in Spain. Mateo sat down at the next table to review photographs from a morning shoot. They didn't speak at first. But after a while, Isabella noticed the photographs displayed on his laptop screen. They were beautiful, moody images of Montreal at night. "You took those?" she asked. Mateo looked up, surprised. "Yes," he replied with a small smile. They talked for nearly 2 hours. About travel, about photography, about the strange feeling of being far from home but somehow exactly where you're supposed to be. After that afternoon, they began seeing each other often. Sometimes they met for coffee. Sometimes they walked through the city with Mateo's camera. Sometimes they spent long evenings talking about their pasts, their families, and the lives they had left behind. To outsiders, their friendship seemed simple. But people who knew Isabella began noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed excited, but also distracted. Sometimes she canceled plans at the last minute. Other times she appeared unusually anxious, checking her phone constantly as if expecting a message that never arrived. When friends asked what was wrong, she brushed it off. "Just work stress," she would say. But the truth was more complicated. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Isabella had discovered something unusual while working on a translation project. The document was supposed to be simple, financial records for a consulting firm. But while translating the material from Spanish to English, she noticed something strange. Several transactions appeared to be disguised under vague descriptions. Large transfers of money between companies in Colombia, Canada, and Spain. Most translators would have ignored it. But Isabella had always been curious. She started looking more closely. The deeper she went, the more suspicious the records became. Eventually, one name appeared repeatedly in the documents. Mateo Alvarez. At first she assumed it was a coincidence. After all, Mateo was a common name. But when she compared the details with what she knew about the photographer she had met, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Same hometown, same age, same spelling. For several days, Isabella said nothing. She continued meeting Mateo, continued laughing with him, continued pretending nothing was wrong. But inside, questions were growing. Questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. One evening, as they walked along the St. Lawrence River, Isabella decided to ask. Mateo, she said casually, have you ever worked with international companies? Mateo looked slightly puzzled. Sometimes, he replied. Why? Just curious, she said quickly. He studied her for a moment, then smiled. You ask interesting questions. She forced a laugh. But something in his eyes made her uneasy. That night, Isabella went home and opened the financial documents again. This time she searched for addresses connected to the companies listed in the files. Several of them pointed to properties in Montreal, office buildings, warehouses, even a small gallery in the Plateau neighborhood. And one address appeared again and again. A building near the old port. The next day, Isabella decided to visit it. From the outside, the building looked ordinary. A renovated warehouse with large windows and modern signage. According to the directory in the lobby, several small businesses rented offices inside. Nothing unusual. But when Isabella stepped inside the elevator, she noticed something strange. The floor listed in the financial documents didn't appear on the panel. There was no button for it. She left the building feeling more confused than before. Later that evening, she met Mateo for dinner. He seemed perfectly normal, relaxed, friendly. The same person she had known for weeks. Yet Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they walked home through Old Montreal, Mateo suddenly stopped. Do you trust me? He asked. The question caught her off guard. Of course, she said. He studied her face carefully, as if searching for something. Then he nodded slowly. Good, he said. And they continued walking. 2 days later, Isabella received an anonymous email. There was no message, only a single photograph attached. It showed the building near the old port. But the photo had been taken at night. And standing near the entrance, was Mateo. Talking to two men Isabella had never seen before. The subject line contained only 3 words. Ask him why. That was the moment everything changed. Isabella didn't know who had sent the email. She didn't know what it meant. But one thing had become clear. Someone was watching. Watching her. Watching Mateo. Watching the questions she had begun asking. For the next 2 days, Isabella barely slept. She kept replaying the situation in her mind. Was Mateo involved in something illegal? Or was someone trying to frame him? Finally, on the night she disappeared, Isabella decided to confront him. She sent him a message asking to meet near the waterfront. Mateo agreed. But before she reached the meeting point, Isabella noticed something that made her heart race. A dark car had been following her for 3 blocks. At first she tried to ignore it. But when she turned onto a quiet street near the harbor, the car slowed again. That's when she sent the message. I think someone is following me. It was the last message she ever sent. Security cameras later showed Isabella walking alone along the street. Then the footage cut out for several minutes due to what investigators described as a temporary technical malfunction. When the cameras came back online, Isabella Clarke was gone. No witnesses. No screams. No signs of a struggle. Just an empty street and the quiet sound of wind coming off the river. When police questioned Mateo Alvarez, he insisted he had been waiting at the meeting point the entire time. But detectives soon discovered something unsettling. Mateo had received a message just minutes before Isabella disappeared. A message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. She knows too much. And from that moment on, the disappearance of Isabella Clarke became one of Montreal's most baffling unsolved mysteries. A case involving international money transfers. anonymous warnings, and two people whose lives had become dangerously intertwined. But what investigators would discover next would make the case far more disturbing than anyone first imagined. And it would raise a chilling question that still haunts the investigation today. Was Mateo Alvarez the man trying to protect Isabella? The disappearance of Isabella Clarke quickly became one of the most unsettling investigations the Montreal police had seen in years. At first, detectives assumed it would follow the familiar pattern of many missing persons cases. A woman disappears late at night. There are no witnesses. A boyfriend or close acquaintance becomes the primary suspect. But within 48 hours, investigators realized this case was anything but ordinary. The street where Isabella had last been seen was covered with surveillance cameras. Old Montreal was a tourist district, and nearly every building had security systems monitoring the sidewalks. Yet somehow, the footage showed almost nothing. The final recording from a restaurant camera captured Isabella walking alone at 9:49 p.m. She was moving quickly, glancing over her shoulder several times as if she felt uneasy. Then she turned the corner toward Rue de la Commune. After that, there was silence. Two cameras that should have captured the rest of the street both went dark for exactly 6 minutes. When the cameras resumed recording, the street was empty. No car pulling away. No struggle. No Isabella. Detectives immediately pulled Mateo Alvarez in for questioning. He arrived at the station looking exhausted but calm. According to his statement, he had been waiting for Isabella near the waterfront cafe where they had agreed to meet. He said she never arrived. When detectives asked about the message she had sent him, "I think someone is following me," Mateo claimed he had tried to call her immediately, but she never answered. The explanation sounded plausible, but investigators had already discovered something Mateo hadn't expected. The anonymous message sent to his phone just minutes before Isabella vanished. She knows too much. Detective Claire Bouchard studied him carefully as she placed the printed message on the table. "Do you know who sent this?" she asked. Mateo stared at the paper for several seconds before shaking his head. "No," he said quietly. "But you have an idea," Bouchard replied. Mateo hesitated. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "I told her not to dig into things that weren't her business," he said finally. The room fell silent. Detective Bouchard leaned forward. "What things?" she asked. Mateo looked up at her, his expression serious. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," she said. Mateo exhaled slowly. Those companies she was translating documents for, they're not normal businesses. Detective Bouchard raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Mateo paused before answering. "They move money," he said. "A lot of money. For what purpose?" Mateo looked down at the table. "That's the problem," he said. "No one really knows." Over the next several hours, Mateo revealed pieces of a story that investigators would spend months trying to verify. According to him, several international consulting firms operating between Colombia, Canada, and Europe were secretly being used to transfer enormous sums of money across borders. The transactions were disguised as legitimate business payments. But the real purpose was much darker. Criminal networks were using these companies to move funds tied to smuggling operations. Not drugs. Not weapons. People. Human trafficking routes that stretched across multiple continents. Montreal had quietly become one of the central hubs. Detective Bouchard listened carefully. "If you knew this," she said, "why didn't you report it?" Mateo gave a bitter laugh. "Because people who report things like that tend to disappear." The statement hung in the air. Just like Isabella had. Investigators quickly confirmed that the financial documents Isabella had been translating were connected to a network of shell companies. Some of the transactions led to addresses in Montreal. Others traced back to Colombia. But the most disturbing discovery came when detectives searched Isabella's apartment. Her laptop was gone. Her phone was missing. And several handwritten notes she had been keeping about the financial records had vanished as well. It looked as though someone had entered her apartment after she disappeared. Someone who knew exactly what to remove. Yet there were no signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. No security footage. Just another layer of mystery. As weeks passed, public attention began growing. Media outlets across Canada started covering the story of the young English woman who had vanished after uncovering suspicious financial transactions. Friends from Manchester traveled to Montreal to plead for answers. Search teams combed the riverbanks and nearby parks. But nothing was found. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining Mateo's background. At first glance, his story seemed genuine. He really was a photographer. He had a portfolio. He had exhibited work in small galleries. But detectives soon noticed something unusual about many of his photographs. The locations. Several of the images he had taken in Montreal showed buildings linked to the same companies appearing in Isabella's financial documents. Warehouses, office spaces, shipping yards. When detectives confronted him about it, Mateo admitted the truth. He hadn't chosen those locations randomly. He had been documenting them deliberately. Because he believed they were connected to the trafficking network. Mateo insisted he had been trying to gather evidence. Evidence he planned to give to an investigative journalist he trusted. But before he could finish his work, Isabella had discovered the same information by accident. And someone else had noticed. 3 months after Isabella vanished, a new clue surfaced. A dock worker at the port of Montreal reported something strange. Late on the night Isabella disappeared, he had seen a black SUV leaving a restricted loading area. The vehicle had been parked near a warehouse tied to one of the shell companies investigators were tracking. The worker hadn't thought much about it at the time. But when he later saw news reports about Isabella Clarke, the memory began bothering him. Police reviewed shipping records for that night. One cargo container had been scheduled to leave Montreal by ship just hours after Isabella disappeared. The container's paperwork listed it as transporting furniture. But when authorities tracked the shipment's destination, they discovered it had been rerouted multiple times before eventually disappearing from official records. The possibility was horrifying. Could Isabella have been taken out of the country inside a cargo container? The theory sparked an international investigation involving law enforcement in Canada, Colombia, and Spain. But despite months of effort, the trail went cold. No one could prove Isabella had been inside that container. And without evidence, the theory remained speculation. Meanwhile, Mateo Alvarez found himself trapped in a strange position. He was no longer considered a suspect. But he was also not completely trusted by investigators. Some detectives believed he had been telling the truth. Others suspected he still knew more than he was admitting. The situation became even more complicated when Mateo received another anonymous message. It arrived exactly 6 months after Isabella disappeared. The message contained a photograph. The image showed Isabella standing on a street somewhere unfamiliar. She looked tired. But she was clearly alive. Behind her was a building with Spanish writing on the wall. The location appeared to be somewhere in South America. There was no caption. No explanation. Only the image. When police examined the photograph, they discovered something even more disturbing. The metadata had been erased. Whoever sent the message had taken great care to hide the photo's origin. Investigators searched desperately for clues in the background. Street signs, architecture, anything that might reveal where Isabella had been taken. But nothing was conclusive. The photo raised more questions than answers. Was Isabella being held somewhere against her will? Had she managed to escape and send a message for help? Or was someone deliberately manipulating the investigation? Months turned into years. Gradually, media attention faded. The case became what detectives quietly referred to as a cold file. But for Mateo Alvarez, the mystery never ended. He continued photographing the city. Continued documenting suspicious locations tied to the financial network Isabella had uncovered. And sometimes, late at night, he returned to the exact street where she had vanished. Standing there, listening to the wind coming off the river, he often replayed their final conversation in his mind. He wondered if he could have stopped her. If he should have told her everything sooner. Or if the moment she started asking questions, Her fate had already been sealed. 5 years later, the case of Isabella Clarke remains unsolved. No body has ever been found. No arrests have ever been made. The photograph showing her alive was never traced to a specific location. And the companies connected to the suspicious financial transactions quietly dissolved, leaving behind almost no trace of their operations. But some investigators still believe the truth lies hidden within those 6 missing minutes of surveillance footage. 6 minutes when the cameras went dark. 6 minutes when an English woman disappeared from a quiet Montreal street. And 6 minutes that may hold the answer to one haunting question that remains unsolved to this day. Did Isabella Clarke uncover a criminal network powerful enough to erase her existence? Or did she vanish because someone she trusted knew exactly what she had discovered? What do you think? Drop your comments. And subscribe for more true crime cold cases.